why you get involved in football, why you play football. It's about match day and winning football matches, and that's what I'm endeavoured to do. This week, obviously, it's more about testing just to get our baselines in terms of where the players are. Obviously, during the summer break, they all had programmes at significance for us because we were looking to get 3 points so that we would be on 54 points, which would have been a record Premier League total for Stoke. So
I hate him. Those 3 words sum up everything Mark Hughes thought about 7 of his players during his managerial career. These were explosive conflicts that spilled onto the pitch, across social media, and tore through the clubs he managed. The drama was so intense, it refused to stay within the touchline. From Manchester to West London to the Midlands, Hughes carried this pattern like a curse. We're walking through all 7 today. If you're enjoying this, hit hype right now, because we're exposing how one of football's most intense managers completely lost control of his dressing room. Mark Hughes earned his nickname Sparky from his fierce physical presence on the pitch. When he transitioned into management, he brought that warrior mentality. Hughes believed football was built on discipline, professional pride, and collective accountability. The dressing room was sacred ground where everyone bowed to the same standards. Hughes operated from a philosophy rooted in the 1980s and 1990s. When players didn't fit his vision, he called them bad apples and removed them. By his 3rd and 4th posts, the bad apples were record signings and stars who could fight back in ways Hughes never anticipated. The PlayStation generation represented everything Hughes struggled to understand. He said plainly, with young players today, a flip chart and pen don't grab their attention. These weren't warriors ready to bleed for the team. These were technical artists, individualists, players who saw themselves as brands rather than soldiers. This fundamental disconnect between his traditionalist philosophy and modern elite football became the fault line running through his managerial career. Number 7. Xherdan Shaqiri. At Stoke City represented everything Hughes wanted but couldn't control. Shaqiri was technically brilliant, a creative talent that could unlock defence with a stroke of genius. During Stoke's relegation season, Shaqiri was genuinely productive, with 7 goals and 6 assists. He was often the team's most dangerous attacking player. Hughes grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as Shaqiri's individualism. The Swiss winger made public comments about his ambition to play at higher levels and was frustrated with his teammates' quality. To Hughes, this was betrayal. Here was a player prioritising his own career over the collective mission. Shaqiri's style, while effective, made the entire team vulnerable at critical moments. Hughes believed this was because Shaqiri lacked the collective defensive cohesion he demanded from every player. The flair versus grit dilemma plagued Hughes's entire career, and Shaqiri embodied that tension perfectly. Hughes wanted the genius, but without the warrior spirit. He felt let down by a player who refused to subordinate his talents to team needs. Number 6. Saido Berahino arrived at Stoke as another attempt to bring elite striker talent. Hughes backed him publicly, hoping that removing pressure would help him rediscover his goal-scoring form. But Berahino's career had stalled. By the time Hughes managed him, Berahino had gone through a 2-year goal drought. The friction centered on professionalism and fitness. Berahino simply wasn't maintaining the physical standards Hughes demanded. Then came an 8-week drug ban that further undermined the narrative Hughes was constructing around the player's recovery. For a manager who valued professional pride as his cornerstone, Berahino's inability to maintain required physical standards felt like fundamental betrayal of the manager-player contract. Berahino had broken the covenant, and Hughes couldn't forgive that. His patience, initially genuine, eventually reached breaking point. This wasn't just about goals or statistics. This was about a player who had failed to respect the warrior code that Hughes held sacred. Number 5. Gianelli Imbula cost Stoke City £18.3 million, making him the club's record signing. That price tag created a problem for Hughes. Imbula had immense physical gifts, but Hughes grew exasperated with what he termed the player's mentality and his inability to grasp the defensive requirements of the Premier League. The dysfunction reached a surreal moment during pre-season when Imbula, frustrated that a teammate had failed to pass him the ball, simply subbed himself off. According to Glenn Johnson's account, Hughes allowed him to return 10 minutes later. Johnson's reaction summed up the bizarre dynamics. If you're the manager, are you going to let that happen? The answer revealed Hughes's fundamental weakness. The bad apple had become a record signing, and the traditionalist manager found himself unable to apply his usual hardline discipline without undermining the club's massive financial investment. That £18.3 million created a psychological logical trap. Hughes had to make the signing work. He couldn't simply dump Imbula the way he dumped rebels at Manchester City, so he tolerated behaviour he would never have accepted from a cheaper player. This represented a crack in his entire management philosophy. Number 4. Joey Barton at Queen's Park Rangers was perhaps the most volatile conflict of Hughes's managerial career. This wasn't merely a personality clash, it was a public debate about accountability, discipline, and what constituted a problematic culture. Barton was already known as difficult, a player who thrived on confrontation, but what happened between him and Hughes transcended typical player-manager friction. The catalyst came during the final game of the 2011/12 season against Manchester City. Barton received a red card for elbowing Carlos Tevez, followed by physical altercations with Sergio Aguero and Vincent Kompany. With 9 men for 35 minutes, QPR somehow clung to survival. Hughes initially tried to frame it as a fantastic day of survival, but the fallout was severe. Barton was stripped of the captaincy and sent on loan to Marseille. Hughes made clear that this behaviour was incompatible with his intended culture. Barton defended himself by claiming he was trying to get an opponent sent off. Hughes, a proponent of professional pride, couldn't accept this justification. The breach of discipline was absolute. Then something unprecedented happened. Barton took to Twitter and launched a scathing critique of Hughes' management. He accused Hughes of shifting blame for QPR's struggles onto the players. Barton claimed the board had backed Hughes completely, that he'd received every resource requested, and the manager had failed despite having everything. More provocatively, Barton dismissed Hughes' success at Stoke, suggesting Hughes had merely inherited a good solid team from Tony Pulis. This was different insubordination. Barton wasn't challenging Hughes privately, he was dismantling his reputation publicly, directly contradicting the narrative Hughes had constructed about his managerial competence. For a traditionalist manager steeped in ideas about respect and hierarchy, Barton's willingness to fight back in the digital arena represented complete collapse of the authority structure. The bad apple could now strike back, and Hughes could do almost nothing about it. Number 3. Tal Ben Haim at Manchester City represented a different threat. If conflicts with Elano and Robinho were about style and discipline, Ben Haim was overtly political. Hughes identified him as one of the ringleaders of a dressing room mutiny against his leadership. Ben Haim had been signed under previous ownership, before the Abu Dhabi takeover. In Hughes's mind, Ben Haim represented the old, less professional culture that needed complete eradication from the club. Hughes was dismayed by Ben Haim's attitude. He perceived the player as actively undermining the coaching staff's efforts to instill a new professional philosophy. The speed with which Hughes sought to move Ben Haim demonstrated his ruthlessness. He offered the defender to Blackburn as part of an exchange deal for Roque Santa Cruz. This wasn't negotiation, this was execution. Hughes wanted Ben Haim out immediately because he represented ideological opposition to the new order. The player embodied everything Hughes was trying to purge from Manchester City's culture. You couldn't negotiate with a mutineer, you couldn't compromise. You removed them, replaced them with players who understood your philosophy. Ben Haim's crime wasn't lack of ability, it was his willingness to question Hughes's authority and influence others to do the same. Number 2. Robinho arrived at Manchester City as a British record signing, a genuine superstar acquisition that signalled the club's new ambitions under Abu Dhabi ownership. But managing Robinho proved far more challenging than Hughes anticipated. Robinho had undeniable talent and extraordinary technical ability, but Hughes struggled with the player's perceived lack of effort in away fixtures and general inconsistency that undermined team stability. The relationship fundamentally soured when Robinho went absent without leave from a training camp in Tenerife. This wasn't a minor infraction, this was a direct challenge to Hughes's authority in front of the entire squad. For a manager who believed players fundamentally need to be told what to do, Robinho's display of individual agency was completely intolerable. Hughes responded by attempting to dismantle the cliques he believed were protecting Robinho's behaviour. He offloaded other players like Joe, trying to surgically remove the support network that allowed Robinho to operate outside the established hierarchy. The Tenerife incident essentially ended any possibility of redemption. Hughes had drawn a line, and Robinho had crossed it. From that moment, the relationship was irreparably damaged. Number 1. Elano at Manchester City was Hughes's first real test managing the technical artist. The relationship between Hughes and this Brazilian midfielder was described as rarely being better than tepid. Elano possessed immense technical ability and had been a favourite of previous manager Sven-Göran Eriksson. This was crucial. Elano embodied the creative freedom that Hughes found fundamentally difficult to reconcile with his demand for tactical rigidity and defensive work rate. Elano wasn't interested interested in tracking back. He wasn't interested in the positional discipline Hughes demanded. He wanted to play consistently. The conflict reached its zenith when Elano complained about his lack of playing time. This was insubordination in Hughes's eyes. A player expressing discontent publicly violated the dressing room code. Hughes responded by labeling Elano a bad apple, signaling that technical brilliance would never substitute for positional discipline and submission to the manager's tactical blueprint. This incident became the template for how Hughes would handle every creative, individualistic player that followed. Elano wasn't the last, he was the first. He set the pattern that would repeat at Manchester City with Robinho, at QPR with Barton, and at Stoke with Shaqiri, Berahino and Imbula. The inability to accommodate the artist player within a system predicated on physical struggle and collective defensive responsibility became Hughes's defining weakness. The pattern across all 7 players reveals something deeper than personality clashes. These weren't random conflicts, they were systemic failures rooted in Hughes's inability to evolve his management philosophy alongside changing elite football. Beneath these 7 feuds lay several interconnected problems Hughes never adequately resolved. The financial cost was staggering. At Stoke City specifically, the combined failure of Imbula, Berahino and Shaqiri to integrate into a cohesive unit contributed directly to relegation. The club lost an estimated £40 million due to that relegation. That figure wasn't just about missing Premier League revenue, it was about the cost of a transfer strategy that prioritised technical flair without ensuring psychological alignment with Hughes's warrior philosophy. £40 million of value destroyed because Hughes couldn't bridge the gap between what he wanted and what he was actually signing. There was also a profound disconnect between the players being signed and Hughes's actual ability to manage them. At both Manchester City and Stoke, Hughes found himself managing players signed entirely on the say-so of owners or directors. He didn't have the recruitment control he'd possessed earlier. This lack of agency in the transfer process led to what observers called a right mess. Players like Imbula were, in effect, getting away with murder because Hughes felt pressure to make the owner's investments work, even when those players were fundamentally ill-suited to his style. Hughes couldn't simply discard them. He had to make them work, or he'd be admitting failure alongside the failed signings. That pressure created compromises that ultimately undermined his entire philosophy. As Hughes attempted to modernize his teams by bringing in superstars, he inadvertently alienated the players who formed the cultural spine of his squads. At Stoke, teammates cited the departure of good lads like Glenn Whelan as the beginning of the end. By replacing these warriors with technically gifted but psychologically detached players, Hughes destroyed the very sturdy defense and team spirit that had been his greatest managerial strength. He was dismantling the foundation that had made his earlier successes possible. It was slow-motion disaster disguised as modernization. The 7 players Hughes couldn't stand can be understood as 3 distinct psychological types, each representing a different way modern football challenged his traditional philosophy. The political agitator category included Tal Ben-Haim and Joey Barton. These players challenged Hughes's authority, not through their football, but through their influence over the dressing room and public narrative. They were mutinous in temperament and problematic in their willingness to contest his leadership. Their challenge was existential because it threatened the hierarchical structure upon which his entire management approach was built. The detached artist category encompassed Elano, Robinho and Shaqiri. These players possessed the technical ability Hughes desired, but lacked the professional pride and defensive work rate he demanded. Their perceived lack of effort in away games or defensive moments became a constant source of frustration. They represented the modern player who saw football as a platform for individual expression rather than collective sacrifice. The professional failure category included Gianelli Imbula and Saido Berahino. These players failed to meet the basic physical and psychological requirements of the professional game as Hughes understood it. Their mentality, fitness, or apparent lack of commitment represented a failure of the warrior contract that Hughes viewed as completely non-negotiable. Early in his career, Hughes's bad apple strategy had been remarkably effective. At Manchester City, he was able to dump rebels and bring in players like Craig Bellamy and Scott Parker who shared his values. These replacements reinforced the culture he was trying to build. By the time he reached QPR and Stoke, this strategy had yielded dramatically diminishing returns. The bad apples were no longer fringe players or squad depth options. They were record signings and public figures with their own media platforms. The narrative Hughes had relied upon, the idea that removing the bad apple would fix everything, became increasingly unconvincing when the bad apples were the players who'd cost the most money. In his final years managing Stoke, Hughes increasingly retreated into the familiar, relying more heavily heavily on stalwarts like Peter Crouch and Charlie Adam rather than genuinely adapting to the modern game. This retreat created a cycle of stagnation that ultimately led to his dismissal. Rather than evolving, rather than finding ways to integrate technical brilliance with his warrior philosophy, Hughes dug in. He defended his approach, blamed the players, and clung to a vision of football that modern football had moved beyond. The bad apple narrative, which had once been useful for consolidating power, became a crutch, allowing him to externalize failure and avoid genuine self-examination. The tragedy of Hughes's managerial career wasn't that he was a bad manager. By any objective measure, he'd achieved significant success at various clubs. The tragedy was that he refused to bridge the fundamental gap between his philosophy and modern football reality. The PlayStation generation wasn't going to disappear. The players with agency, with ambition beyond the dressing room, with desire for global recognition, weren't going to suddenly become obedient soldiers. Rather than finding ways to accommodate this evolution, Hughes increasingly saw it.